Meanwhile, the World Bank President AJ Banga says the sure path to growth for the African continent is intra-African trade. He made the comment at the ongoing IMF World Bank annual meeting at Marrakesh, Morocco. Joining us now for analysis is Adebayo Adeleke, founder, Supply Chain Africa, joining me via Zoom. Great to have you on the show. Good morning.
Good morning, Larry. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and thank you for staying up. I know it's really early right there in the U.S. Thank you for staying up and joining us this morning. But you see, the World Bank president now has emphasized the importance of, intra-Africa trade, for the African continent's growth. Could you share your perspective on where Africa is right now? Is there any notable improvement so far with intra-Africa trade? We've been talking about this for the longest time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Larry, for having me. Yes, we are at the onset of the African Intercontinental Trade Agreement. More or less is a facilitating agreement for the most part. There's a lot of things at play for the past few years. Just setting up the trade agreement is quite imperative. Getting all the countries on board, but that's one battle. And there's another battle is aligning all the necessary policies within these countries to be able to make sense of intra-African trade. It's an Herculean task, to say the least, because we have different democratic values, if any at all, in some countries. So we have different economic leanings as well. So all these things we have to make sense of all these things are quite aligned to be able to facilitate intra-African trade. And I know the agency ahead of, kind of managing this, have had a lot of work at hand because they have the digital aspect, the digital trade aspect of it. You have policy aspect of it. And then you have these different governments, different sector of the continent. You have the ECOWAS, you have the Central Africa, you have the Southern African countries as well, the Northern African countries, and every one of them has regional issues that they're actually contending with amongst everything else. Then we have to kind of facilitate all this trade. So I can say categorically we are at the onset of it. It's going to take years to really see the full-fledged of what intra-African trade can actually do. But if we kind of look into the future, have a snapshot in what the future is going to look like. The future is bright if every country can have this mass effort towards this initiative of trading within African countries, trading among itself.
Share your thoughts now on the key hurdles that need to be overcome to boost, intra-African trade, and what strategies or recommendations you have for, addressing these challenges.
Well, there's a lot. Well, let's start with security first. Even security is the center point of everything. It's a bedrock of trade. It's a bedrock of economy. As we've seen the last few years, a lot of African countries, a lot of them have been kicked out. The majority of them that have been part of it have been kicked out of ECOWAS. We have Guinea, we have Mali, Burkina Faso. Now we have Niger, and then Chad on the other hand as well. Then we've seen one in Gabon. All these things have, the coup d'etat that is going on over there has not really facilitated trade. And as we continue to see this authoritarian regime or military junta, so to say, across Africa, instability in African security is kind of underpins the actualization of inter-African trade. So for this to really happen, and I know the reason, organically speaking, from information we've gathered so far over the years, is because a lot of these military juntas came into being because they felt that democracy hasn't given them the necessary so-called output of democracy. And I get it. But at the same time, military junta and authoritarian regimes are not the answer to it. So we have to solve these things. And one of my recommendations is to but these recommendations can only take place when in a democratic environment, not in the military junta, because it encourages all to participate in the democratic process of this country so as to facilitate socioeconomic prosperity of these countries. Because without socioeconomic prosperity, there will be no productivity, nobody will be able to do anything that will facilitate trade. So that's one part. And then on the second part, African trade route has been always is a colonialist in nature. Most of the African trade route, and I've said this on your show before, and I've said it in most of my writings, African trade has always historically been to drive resources out of the continent. So if you look and see, most of the trade that we do right now is for countries that are outside the continent of Africa. So for us to actually reroute these things for African African countries to trade among themselves, we have to change the trade routes, either by the road corridors or the land corridors, rather, the air, the rail. And some countries actually use rail, and also the waterways. Most of African countries, as of today, do not have trade routes for at least for different corridors. And the land corridor is probably the easiest part. And I know a lot of countries have done a lot of road networks, but these road networks are just still pushing resources out of the continent, not to move resources from one country to the other. So that has to be realigned. And if that is realigned, of course, the custom issues, the tariff issues, and everything will follow suit. So those are the two quick, easy ways that we can actually realign and get this African Continental Free Trade Agreement on board. And I know a lot of discussions, a lot of work has been done, a lot of policy change has been done. But there's one thing about policy change, there's one thing action in the policy change, and that can be very brutal sometimes because a lot of personal and national interest. And we also have to put into consideration the sovereignty issues as well. Each country has something, and that's one thing Africans haven't done in the past few years. We are so territorial in our nature that it's going to take a while, consumer behavior change, to be able to drive those kind of, because consumer behavior drives demand, and demand drives supply. So in a way, we have to kind of change those consumer behavior, and that can be done through the sovereignty realm of each country. So each country has a lot of work to do in evangelizing and advocating for African trade to happen.
Right, and definitely, I'm sure, definitely countries are working towards this. I did see in a supermarket recently, I saw, they had some blueberries there for sale, and I saw that the blueberries were from, Mozambique, and I saw that and I actually smiled. But are there any notable initiatives or policies that, African governments are implementing to encourage and, enhance intra-Africa trade, and how can private sector players, like yourself, collaborate, with these efforts?
So I've always pushed this forward that, for every trade and in every economy, that supply chain drives it. It's like a train track. It's like a track at which trade runs on supply chain. So for us to be able to actualize a free trade agreement across Africa, or facilitating agreement, because it's not really a free trade, you're facilitating trade among African countries, is that we need to kind of re-educate and reorient the African supply chain body as a whole, because those are the drivers of trade and economic prosperity. From Supply Chain Africa, that's one of our key tasks, is to make sure that we re-educate African supply chain providers, also every school procurement providers in these so-called African intra-African trade. And most importantly is that each country has to put it upon themselves of how to drive this. Each country has its own economic agenda, and that thing, from my perspective, I don't think those things have been sinking. Ghana, the way Ghana is doing business and Benin Republic is doing business, and let's look at Benin Republic and Nigeria, very close to neighbors. If anything happens in Nigeria shut its borders, which has happened in the past few years, it really affects Benin Republic. And Nigeria has its own internal issues. They have to boost its own trade as we have continued to go. Devaluation of Naira, we need to produce more and be able to ship more out to different African countries. But the other African countries are not receiving it, or they have a different perspective of how they receive the Nigerian produce. It becomes a very challenging issue. So we have to kind of sync these things, and Africa and then supply chain professionals are at the helm of this to make this happen. So what I've seen so far, and what I believe African, different economics bodies in African countries have to come together, because the African Union is doing it with the Secretariat in Ghana, but African countries independently have to look at, these issues independently. Because what I've seen, for example, with the new government, with President Tinubu government in Nigeria, has been facilitating a lot of work with Nigeria and other African countries, with the other countries outside of Africa. But let's look at, how is the present administration in Nigeria can facilitate trade and economic prosperity among its neighbors. And I know there's a lot of discussion in ECOWAS, but we've yet to see some traction going. So if Africa can actually, kind of sync the economic prosperity among its neighbors, I think we have a lot of things. And some of the devaluation of Naira that we experience right now will be slowed a bit, because But we're so focused on this international market that we neglect the neighbors around us. So those are the areas we need to focus more, and we need to actually channel our policies in, making sure that the people, the countries around us, are actually benefiting from our trade facilities rather than focusing much more on international markets.
And talking about the AfCFTA, definitely a significant development right now. How do you view its progress and its impact on the continent's trade dynamics? I know a couple of countries are already trading, under this agreement. I did, hear about Kenya sometime earlier this year. They've already started, taking advantage. Tell us more about, some success stories right now.
Yes, they've started testing on this new agreement. For example, like you mentioned, Kenya. Most people don't know that Kenya, beside China and Sri Lanka, has the largest tea export. So, but again, if you tell Nigerians that you want to drink Kenyan tea, they'll look at you like crazy, because most Nigerians don't even know that Kenya actually is a bedrock of tea exportation. There's a lot of, they've tested those things, but, and it has worked. And don't get me wrong, it has really worked. But the path at which it worked is what really concerns me, because from what I heard, I might be wrong on this, but when I heard, most of this trade was done via air, and that is quite problematic, because air transportation to facilitate large national trade, is quite unsustainable for the most part. So we have to figure out a way to get this on the ground, open those supply and logistical pipelines in such a way that we can have massive trade among different countries. So far, the litmus test has been great, but in a controlled environment, a controlled system, whereby Kenya is doing a trade with another country, with Ghana or some other country. So it's very controlled. But let's open it up a bit. Let's make it more interesting in such a way and in such a manner that we put all the necessary factors and variables in there and see how these the trade agreement actually pan out and be able to twist and tweak as necessary. From my point of view, I think it's a great experiment, because everything in this world is pretty much an experiment. And I think if we continue to adjust the variables, I think we'll get there. And I'm an advocate of it. I believe it's a way for Africa to prosper. And actually, we used to do this hundreds of years ago. African, what we now call the geopolitical space that we call Africa. Our first encounter with the outside world is through trade. So we've traded over the course of time, but due to colonization and whatnot, we kind of deviated from that. And I think we need to go back to what actually made us prosperous over centuries ago, which is trading among ourselves, the sub-Sahara trade. I mean, you've read a lot of those things in the books, but actually they actually happened, and that's what brought prosperity to Africa. So we need to get back to the drawing board, to the basics, and I think it's doable. So far, the onset of it is great, but we need to expand it. We need to kind of veer away from this controlled environment and make it quite more interesting and get more variables in it and see how it's gonna pan out. So I think it's a move in the right direction. I believe we can continue to champion this, but each country has to have an effort towards making it happen. It cannot happen from African Union perspective. Each country has to make it a point of duty that Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement must work. If not, we're kidding ourselves, and it's going to be a long time before we really have the full actualization of what the Intercontinental Free Trade Agreement is supposed to look like.
Yeah, we definitely need to make it work at this time. But talk to me now about currency. Before I let you go, we know most African currencies are under pressure, right now.
Yes.
See, the Naira also is under a lot of pressure. Is there a way we can, trade with our own currencies, in Africa to, strengthen our currencies? I know everyone's talking about, de-dollarization and all of that. We know King Dollar is that, preferred currency for trade. But how can we, use, intra-Africa trade to actually strengthen our currencies here?
Absolutely, and I think some countries they've tried it before, but there's one thing putting one thing out, there's another thing going through it. And that has been the storyline. We African countries have tried this over the course of time. Actually, before we even use currency, before what we now call Naira, dollar came to be, we've always traded values. And that's always been the what value, the value for value. And I think, I believe that can strengthen, in a massive way. But one thing underpins anything, any trade, is what value are you bringing? And in African country perspective is the fact that we're not producing enough. we have to produce. We have to produce enough to trade with, and that's what. And for that to happen, there's a lot of infrastructure built within the countries that needs to happen to be able to produce more. So if you don't produce, then what are you going to be able to trade with? And that's the bottom line of it all. So, and you can't have one without having the other. It's like, chicken or egg, which one comes first? So we have to build up infrastructure within our countries to be able to produce more. And I think that will not in every country. There are whatever resources within your means to be able to build the best of their ability. If your textile is what you do best, invest in it and trade with it. And I think if we can actually do that across Africa, I think we're up to something great. But everyone is still just posing all around the place and, kind of in a way that is quite unstable for us. So we have to make sure that we continue to kind of facilitate those infrastructures to be able to move those and produce more. Now, we in Nigeria, we have infrastructure to produce a lot of product, and we haven't capitalized on it. It's either oil, it's agricultural product. Agricultural sector is supposed to be the biggest sector that's supposed to benefit from this intra-African trade. But yet, we've not been able to facilitate it because our agri sector is suffering a lot. Is it through grazing? Is it through storage issues? All these things can help us actually. But if we can buckle down a bit and actually, settle down those infrastructures and build those infrastructures to make a massive produce, that we're up to something. Yes, we can trade with it, and it will definitely help our currency out. But we have to produce first.
All right. I guess bottom line is produce more. Produce so that we can trade more. Thank you so much, Deboyo Adeleke, founder, Supply Chain Africa. It was great having you today. Thank you so much.
It's good to see you again, Larry.
Good to see you too. Thank you.